Genesis 41 to 45 clearly presents Joseph as the prince of Egypt, and not as someone bragging about his newfound greatness. The royal court of Egypt serves only as the background for something that is far more glorious and lasting. These 5 chapters covered here describes the working of God's sovereign grace in the life of Joseph the person and the lives of his guilty brothers. Joseph, though empowered by the might of Egypt, uses that power not to avenge, but to forgive his distressed brothers. For his brothers, it's been more than 20 years. Too long. They have been extremely troubled, mentally confused, distracted, distressed, harassed by their own guilt. Their wounds run deep. In fact, about 130 verses of these chapters focus solely on their tortuous journey, compared to only about 25 verses on Joseph himself. When you consider the nature of their sin, the impact it had on them is telling. They conspired to kill their own flesh and blood. Then they cover it up and continue to lie about it to their father as he mourns each passing anniversary. It broke their hearts, the heavy sense of guilt continually weighing in on them. Because of this guilt, any event, whether good or bad, the brothers instinctively thought that they had been punished by God. Note Judah's guilt, who put forth the idea to sell Joseph to their cousins, the Ishmaelites, in Genesis 37. The next chapter, Genesis 38, is out of place in the flow of this story, as it talks about Judah and Tamar. The story of Joseph picks up again in Genesis 39, where he arrives in Egypt and is bought by Potiphar. Why is Genesis 38 inserted here? Genesis 38 describes Judah's apostasy. In guilt, he leaves the covenant family and lives amongst the Canaanites. The death of his 2 sons and his incestuous relationship with Tamar, his daughter-in-law, can only be interpreted by him as punishment for his guilt. He returned home humiliated. When Joseph decided to keep a brother in prison until they bring Benjamin to him, or when they find that their money is returned in their bags, the brothers' sense of guilt haunts them mercilessly. In fact, in Genesis 43:23, according to Joseph's house steward, the money placed in their bag was Joseph's own money, not theirs. The steward said, "Be at ease, do not be afraid. I had your money." Literally, it means your money had come to me. You see, Joseph was already reaching out to his brothers, but they saw it differently. In Genesis 42:21, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. In verse 26, it further says, what is this that God has done to us? Even when they are invited to Joseph's house for a meal, they fear punishment. And as they dine with Joseph, guilt was eating them. They fully believe at long last that their sin had caught up with them. And when Joseph finally reveals himself, the NIV says that they were terrified. At long last, they cower before the one they have wronged, just as the dream predicted. And Joseph had the right and the power to wreak revenge. They know they deserve death, so they are silent. They offer no excuses, no defense. They quietly fear the judgment that they deserve. Let's note Joseph's reaction. Joseph certainly had reasons to be very upset with his brothers, based on what they did to him. But he uses his power and wealth to facilitate and to forgive his guilty brothers. Unbeknown to them, he had been testing them to see if they were still the jealous mob of 20 years ago. What he observed begins to break his heart. Finally, the humble prince of Egypt is totally overwhelmed. Genesis 45:1 says that Joseph could not control himself. He made himself known to his brothers. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Is my father still alive? Why does Joseph say that? He knows that his father is still alive because Judah has just mentioned his father 15 times in his 17-verse speech. You see, Joseph is an emotional wreck. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Genesis 45:45. Let's note the reason for Joseph's forgiveness. Joseph forgives them totally and completely. But what reason does he give for forgiving them? Note, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." Genesis 45:5. Joseph emphasized this point by repeating it 2 more times in verses 6 to 7. Joseph is saying, do not be angry with yourselves because God is in control. God uses even your sin for His glory and for His purpose and for your good. God used their very sin, the sin they hated, the sin that has led them to their guilt, to save not only the Egyptians, but to save them as well. The perpetrators of the evil deed are saved by God working through that very evil deed. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound to save such brothers like this. And the same is true for us. God works all things together for the good of us. We too can have freedom from the guilt of our own sin because we know that God is in control. Because of His grace and forgiveness, He will use even our sin for His good and sovereign purposes. Sometimes we feel, I blew it, my life is now a mess. I've disobeyed God so much that I'll never be able to get back to where I should be. Does sin have consequences? Yes, by all means. Remember, Joseph has suffered as a slave and as a prisoner for 13 years. He will never get those years back. For the brothers, 20 plus years of continual guilt and suffering. But God, who is in control, uses the very consequences of their sin to make them effective for Him. What is the worst sin that someone has committed against you? Who committed that sin? A parent, a child, a wife, a husband, an employer, an employee, or perhaps a stranger, someone you'll never see again. Have you forgiven that person? Yes, forgiveness is not something that comes easily or readily to many of us. Is forgiveness all about you? Why should you forgive that person? There are at least 2 biblical answers to that question. One is that if you belong to Jesus, because Jesus has forgiven you, you must also forgive. The second is that God is the one who will see that justice is done, no matter what happened to you. However, Joseph highlights a different biblical principle of forgiveness. And Joseph says, I forgive you because God is sovereign, because God is in control. Joseph's forgiveness saved his brothers' lives, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Beyond that, their whole family, 17 of them, were saved. Have you forgiven that person? Why should you forgive that person? Forgive him, forgive her, Forgive them. Forgive them for their unjustifiable acts of evil. How often? Jesus says 70 times 7. Why? To save much lives. And it includes your life, their lives, and beyond them. You see, when you forgive, it is for something and someone higher, beyond you. And it's not just about you. It's for God's purpose and God's glory.